I am Hannah Weiss, the Director of Education at the Science Museum of Western Virginia, and this is your Moment of STEM. And as we're still kind of careening towards the end of October and, spooky season, we're going to continue on our marathon of the science behind scary things. And this week, we're going to talk about a movie favorite, zombies. So when we're talking about zombies, there are so many scientific rabbit holes that we could go down that it's really, really important that we kind of narrow down the topic, right? So as we're talking about zombies, I don't want to talk about the science behind what might have inspired zombies because we've actually been there before. Rabies, it's probably rabies. I also don't really want to talk about kind of the real world analogs of what zombies look like, because a lot of that is parasites. And I've actually done a parasite episode too for Father's Day, which is a lot more loving than it sounds. My dad's a parasitologist. So what I really, really want to talk about, what I really kind of want to dive into is, would a zombie pandemic happen? Would we have this kind of worldwide outbreak of a zombie disease, right? Something that started as a local epidemic, a local outbreak that spread beyond the confines. And I've got to say, when I started doing research into this, I really thought the answer was going to be no. And I've kind of surprised myself. But I thought the answer was going to be no because we, as people, are remarkably good at handling emerging diseases that are kind of just starting and have new symptoms and new things. There are so many local, national, and international organizations that work really hard to identify new diseases and figure out how to stop them from spreading. And we see this all over the place, right? We've even seen it fairly recently with the SARS outbreak. WHO, CDC, they were right on top of it, identifying people who were infected, putting out information about what it was and what it looked like, helping make sure that local governments had enough money, resources, people to really kind of handle what was happening. And we were kind of able to contain it, right? Because these organizations are devoted to identifying, containing, and spreading information about these new diseases. Even more often, they're even using social media resources to get information out there so that healthcare professionals and local communities are able to protect themselves while still helping potentially affected members of their communities. And they're also using mathematical models to figure out which areas are potentially going to need the most medical intervention. So I really thought that my answer to this question was going to be no. But then I started digging a little deeper and I found out that there's a lot in containing epidemics and outbreaks that really has to do with what the disease is, what the thing that's trying to be stopped is, and a lot of questions that have to be answered. For example, what is it that's causing the symptoms? Is it mass hysteria? That happens. Those are actually pretty hard to stop. Is it a bacterial infection? We've got antibiotics, so unless it's a terrifying strain resistant, those we can stop. Or a virus, somewhat harder, or even a prion disease like mad cow is an example of. And that's kind of one part of questions that have to be answered in how we stop these epidemics. But another question is the spread. And that's really the key to being able to take something that's an epidemic, kind of a localized outbreak, and stop it from becoming a pandemic, something that hits the world. Things that are spread through food are sometimes easier to contain because we can recall the product, we can identify who was affected, we can pump stomachs if people have ingested things. Diseases that are spread through really, really intense kind of body contact, so things that might spread through fluid or biting, can be a little easier to contain because you have to be up close and personal with someone who's infected. And so it's pretty easy to identify who has gotten exposed and work out methods of quarantining them. But things that spread through the air, things that are droplet or airborne, those are really tricky to stop. And that's why the flu is such a potentially scary disease because, well, it's everywhere. In fact, the CDC has a pandemic response team for the flu because the flu just is a pandemic. So when we're looking at these zombie movies and trying to identify what even is it, most movies use viruses, which is good and bad. It's not a bacteria. It's not something we can stop with an antibiotic, but we do know what viruses are, and we sort of know how to identify them. And most of them are spread through that kind of close contact. You have to be bitten to be infected, which means that it's probably pretty easy to identify who's been infected, because most people are going to remember being bitten. Of course, then you have to think about time from infection to contagion, time from when you first get exposed to this disease to when you are someone who can spread it out. And that's where the zombie movies kind of differ. Some of them are really, really immediate, meaning it might be difficult to track it. Some of them are a longer exposure. And if it's a longer exposure, people react differently to being told they have to be quarantined and stay in one place. And you might have some people who are afraid of what the response might be. They might hole up somewhere if they get infected and not share that information, or think that they're someone who's not going to show symptoms of the disease. And that can spread things. We've actually seen that with some recent outbreaks, in particular the Ebola epidemic that's going on right now, and the previous one. Sometimes people who have been infected have been scared of the response, and so have not gone to get medical treatment. All of these things put together make it very, very difficult to say for certain whether or not a zombie outbreak is something that our current structure could contain, or if it would kind of explode out and get everywhere. Some of the really interesting things that are happening, though, is that researchers are actually using the idea of a zombie epidemic to communicate their work. They're doing mathematical models of outbreaks to identify where the safest place might be, or how they could make sure to get kind of responses to the right place, and people are paying attention. So if you would like to read any more about how we respond to pandemics, some of the interesting diseases out there, or the research being done on zombies, you can check out any of the links below. Otherwise, I'm Hannah Weiss from the Science Museum of Western Virginia, and probably my favorite thing to come out of this zombie mania is the fact that the CDC recently published a guideline of things you could do to kind of survive a zombie apocalypse. And it's this really tongue-in-cheek way of getting people excited and prepared for any emergency. But it worked. People paid attention and shared it like crazy.